Hello. In this lecture, I would like to continue our discussion of the nature of validity from the last lecture, and I'd like to distinguish between two different kinds of validity. And getting clear on this distinction will also help us get even more clear on just what our subject matter for this course is, on just what it is that logic is about. So on one way of thinking about it, logic is the study of how to figure out which arguments are formally valid. Now note that I didn't just say here it's about how to figure out which arguments are valid, but which arguments are formally valid. Alright, but what the heck does that mean? What is this notion of formal validity? Well, that is the topic of this lecture. And to help us to get an initial grip on what formal validity is, I want to look at an example of an argument, one that I might put up for discussion in an ethics class, that goes like this. First premise: if murder is wrong, then capital punishment is wrong. The thought behind this premise presumably being that capital punishment is itself a form of murder. Second premise: murder is wrong. Conclusion: therefore, capital punishment is wrong. Now, I'm not claiming for this argument that it's sound. I'm not claiming that it's not sound. This is not an ethics class, and this is not a topic with which we are concerned. All that we care about right now is that this argument is valid. Whether you agree with the conclusion or not, whether you think the argument is sound or not, any rational person can see that, as a matter of fact, the conclusion does follow from the premises of this argument. That it's not possible for both the premises to be true, but for the conclusion to be false. Okay, now let's let the letter P abbreviate the phrase murder is wrong in this argument, and let's replace all the occurrences of that phrase with P. And let's also do the same for the phrase capital punishment is wrong. Let's let that phrase be abbreviated by the letter Q, and let's replace all the occurrences of that phrase in the argument with the letter Q. Okay, now we have this argument pattern. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Here's a question. Suppose that you turned on this video clip, but you dozed off and you missed what it was that P and Q stood for, and you just woke up and you see me talking about this slide. Can you tell, or could you tell, just by examining the structure of this argument alone, without knowing what P and Q stand for, that it's a valid argument? Well, I think if you reflect on it for a moment, you'll see that the answer is yes. You can tell that regardless of what P and Q stand for, provided that P and Q stand in for some meaningful declarative sentences, that this argument is in fact valid. In fact, we can see that any argument that fits this argument pattern is valid. Just upon reflection, we can see that that is true. This is, in fact, a famous example of a good argument pattern, one that's known as modus ponens, and this is an argument pattern that we'll encounter again in the course. Okay, so the argument that we've been considering has a special property. Not only is it valid, it's formally valid. And what that means is that one can tell, just by examining its structure alone, even without considering what its premises mean, that it is valid. And one can tell this because one can tell that it is an instance of a valid argument pattern. Now, not all valid arguments are like this. So let's consider another example. Consider the following argument. If Mary's only folder is not red all over, then it is blue all over. Mary's only folder is blue all over. Therefore, Mary's only folder is not red all over. I want to ask two questions about this argument. The first question is this argument valid? And the second question is this argument formally valid? Okay, so let's start by considering the first question. Is this argument valid? Well, consider again our definition of validity. An argument is valid if and only if it is not possible both that all its premises be true, but that its conclusion be false. So here's a question. Is it possible that Mary's only folder is both blue all over and red all over? Well, the answer, I think, is obviously not. And if you don't see this, just think a little harder about it. So I might be able to write a consistent story, for example, in which Mary is clairvoyant and Mary has other kinds of psychic abilities, including, say, being able to set her folder on fire with her mind. And that would be a fanciful story, but it would be an internally consistent story. If I read that story, I would think it was a work of fantasy, but I wouldn't think that it was just ridiculous in the sense that I didn't even think that it was possibly true in any possible world. But now suppose you had written the story and you told me in the story that Mary's only folder was both blue all over and red all over. Well, that's ridiculous in a way that even entertaining the thought that Mary has these special abilities to set things on fire with her mind is not. I can't even imagine a universe in which it's true that Mary's folder is both blue all over and red all over. In fact, I think I can see that it's not possible for there to be such a universe. So it's not possible that Mary's only folder is both blue all over and red all over. Okay, well, if you agree with me on that, then you should agree with me that it is not possible for the second premise of this argument to be true, but for the conclusion to be false. That is, if in fact Mary's only folder is blue all over, then it's not possible that her only folder is also red all over. So we've just seen that it's not possible for 2 to be true, but for 3 to be false. Okay, but then it trivially follows that it's not possible for both the premises of this argument, both 1 and 2 to be true, but for the conclusion 3 to be false. So, since it's not possible for the premises of this argument to be true, but for its conclusion to be false, this is in fact a valid argument. Okay, let's move on to question 2. Is this argument formally valid? Well, let's let P abbreviate Mary's only folder is not red all over, and let's let Q abbreviate Mary's only folder is blue all over. If we replace the phrases in this argument with their abbreviations, we get this argument pattern. If P, then Q, Q, therefore P. Now, suppose we didn't know what P and Q stood for. Could we tell by the structure of this argument alone that the argument is valid? Well, if we reflect on it, I think we can see that the answer is no. We can't tell just by looking at the structure of this argument alone that the argument is valid. So look at this argument pattern again. If P, then Q, Q, therefore P. Now suppose that P stood for it is raining and Q stood for the streets are getting wet. Alright, if those were what P and Q stood for, then from this argument pattern we would get this. If it is raining, then the streets are getting wet. The streets are getting wet, therefore it is raining. Now, here's a question. Is it possible that both of the premises of this argument are true, but the conclusion is false? Is it possible that it's true that if it's raining, then the streets are getting wet? The streets are getting wet, but it's not raining? Well, sure it is. It might be, for example, that 1 is true and 2 is true, but it's a sunny, cloudless day, and the reason that the streets are getting wet is because a sprinkler is on. So, not knowing what P and Q means, for all we know, they could mean it is raining and the streets are getting wet. So for all we know, the argument that we're looking at could be this one. And we can clearly see that this argument is not valid. So we can't tell by the structure of our original argument alone that it's a valid argument. The only way we can tell that the argument about Mary's folder that we examined originally is valid is by understanding what the premises mean and having some insight into what it is for a folder to be red all over and what it is for a folder to be blue all over. We can't tell just by examining the structure of the argument that it's valid. So that argument is not formally valid. It's not formally valid because we can't tell by its structure alone that it's valid. And we figured this out by examining the argument pattern of which it was an instance and noting that that argument pattern has invalid instances. So in general, we can say that an argument pattern is valid just in case all of its instances are valid and invalid otherwise. So the argument pattern that we just examined, in fact, if P then Q, Q therefore P, is a famous example of an invalid argument pattern, one that is sometimes referred to as affirming the consequent. And we can see that this is an invalid argument pattern because we can produce examples of arguments that fit that pattern but which are invalid. So we gave such an example. If it's raining, the streets are getting wet. The streets are getting wet, therefore it is raining. We saw that that was an instance of that argument pattern that was invalid, an instance where it's possible for the premises to be true, but for the conclusion to be false. So arguments that fit an argument pattern but are invalid are called counterexamples to that pattern. Note, however, that an invalid argument pattern can still have valid instances. So our argument concerning Mary's folder is one of those. It's a valid instance of an invalid argument pattern. We will say that valid arguments that are instances of valid argument patterns are formally valid, and that valid arguments that are instances of invalid argument patterns are informally valid. So our original argument about capital punishment was both valid and formally valid. And our argument about Mary's folder was valid, but it wasn't formally valid. So we'll say that it's informally valid. So here are some general takeaway lessons. Any formally valid argument is valid. That's because a formally valid argument is an argument that you can tell is valid just by examining its structure alone. But the same doesn't hold in the other direction. An argument may be valid without being formally valid. A formally valid argument is an argument that is an instance of a valid argument pattern. And one way to discover that an argument pattern is not valid is to think of a counterexample to it. That is an argument that fits the pattern but which is not valid. That's what we did when we gave the argument concerning it's raining and the streets being wet. We showed that that was an argument that fit the argument pattern in question, but which was in fact an invalid argument. Okay, let's get back to the subject of what logic is about. At the beginning of the lecture, I said that logic may be thought of as the study of which arguments are formally valid. And we've seen that the question of which arguments are formally valid is equivalent to the question of which argument patterns are formally valid. So another way to think about what logic is to think about it as the study of formally valid argument patterns. And in the rest of the course, what we'll be doing is finding ways of testing to see whether certain kinds of argument patterns are valid argument patterns. And we will start that in our next series of lectures for the next week. I'll see you then.